Hey everyone, tonight we enter the misted silence of Feudal Japan, a place where every role was written before you could speak and every mistake could echo down a generation. This wasn't a world of ambition, it was a stage and everyone had a script they couldn't change. If that sounds fascinating, stay with me. Turn the lights low, maybe sip something warm, and settle into a world where being still meant staying alive. Imagine being born and immediately placed on a shelf you could never leave, not because you were weak, but because the rules didn't allow movement. Feudal Japan wasn't a free for all society, it was rigid, silent, layered like lacquer. At the top stood the emperor, a figure more spiritual than sovereign. Below him, the shogun, the true wielder of power, often seen as a shadow king. Then came the daimyo, the lords of lands, war-hardened and feared. Then the samurai, swordsmen sworn to honor, discipline, and death before disgrace. Below them stood peasants, artisans, and merchants, and far beneath all, the ita, the outcast. Let's start with the samurai. A boy born into a samurai family didn't play with wooden swords, he bowed to them. He learned to sit before he learned to run, to listen before he learned to speak. His toys were lacquered fans and ritual script. By 5, he was studying strategy. By 7, archery and calligraphy. By 10, he could recite his family's honor code without missing a syllable. His father's eyes watched, not for warmth, but for weakness, because any flaw could become dishonor, and dishonor wasn't shame, it was death. A samurai didn't just fight, he dressed in silence. He walked without sound. He bowed with his back straight and thoughts buried deep. His sword wasn't just a weapon, it was his soul. To lose it or to draw it without cause meant social collapse. To live as a samurai was to walk a blade sharper than steel. Now shift your eyes to the peasant class. You might think they were weak, but they were the spine of the nation. They grew rice, the currency of power. They rose before the sun, tied their sandals with calloused hands, and stepped into knee-deep mud. Rain, sun, famine, it didn't matter. The land had to yield. They had no luxury, no poetry in their lives, yet they were the ones who kept the nobles alive. And yet they were taxed brutally. Sometimes half their harvest was taken, and if they were caught hiding rice to feed their families, punishment was swift and often fatal. Artisans lived between beauty and burden. They created swords, silk, ceramics, and tools. Their work was meticulous, precise, slow, but it was rarely praised. A swordsmith might work months on a single blade and never know the warrior who wielded it. A kimono maker dyed cloth with tears and ash, shaping patterns no one noticed. Yet they labored not for applause, but for honor in silence. And then came the merchants. They had money, but money wasn't trusted. They bought and sold things others made. They didn't toil, they didn't bleed. So society viewed them as parasites. Even the richest merchant had to bow deeply to a penniless samurai. Wealth wasn't the currency of respect, discipline was. Merchants lived behind paper walls, hid their luxuries, and donated to temples to buy a sliver of status. Then there were the Ita, the untouchables. They skinned animals, buried the dead, executed criminals. Their work was essential, but their presence was erased. They lived in separate villages. Children were told to avoid them. Even the wind seemed to blow away from their homes, but without them, society would rot. They carried the burden of purity by living in impurity. And no matter what they did, they remained below forgiveness. Now imagine a woman in this world. Born into any class, her path was narrow. She learned how to serve, how to kneel, how to speak in half tones. Her clothing was bound, her footsteps small. Her purpose was family, obedience, silence. Even in wealth, she couldn't own property. Even in love, she couldn't choose her path. And if she stepped outside the mold, society stepped on her. But not all of feudal Japan was quiet misery. There was grace in the rituals. There was pride in perfection. There was poetry in stillness. We ended last time with a bow. So let's begin again with a silence. Feudal Japan wasn't just structured in class, but in rhythm. Every hour of your day was a ritual. Every action had a form. Every movement was watched, if not by others, then by your own memory of rules. Let's walk through a day in a samurai household. At sunrise, you wake not to sunlight, but to responsibility. There is no snooze, no stretch. You sit upright in perfect posture, legs tucked beneath you. You bow before standing. Your bedding is folded into a neat square. Your robe is wrapped left over right, always left over right, because the opposite is used for the dead. Even dressing is a ceremony. You wash your face with cold water using a porcelain bowl brought by an attendant or elder. There is no mirror. Vanity is discouraged. You comb your hair neatly, tie it if you are male, pin it if you are female. Then you kneel in front of the small family shrine, hands pressed in prayer, head lowered, not for wishes, but for gratitude, because survival itself is sacred. Your breakfast is small, structured, and eaten in silence. A bowl of rice, a miso soup with floating tofu, some pickled radish or seaweed, everything served in lacquerware. You wait for the eldest to begin. You chew slowly. You place your chopsticks horizontally after finishing, never stuck into rice because that resembles funeral offerings. Now for the samurai child, it's time for practice. Sword forms, kata, repeated until the wrist aches. Balance training, 1 foot on polished wood for minutes. Meditation, legs folded, back straight, eyes lowered, breathing counted. Calligraphy, each stroke must breathe intention. Poetry, haiku, recited, not written from memory. Nothing is random. Nothing is wasted. The samurai adult, meanwhile, is either attending his lord's court or walking his land. He carries 2 swords, the long katana and the short wakizashi. Together they form the daisho, a symbol of his class. They're never drawn without reason. To unsheath one in public is to risk everything. A duel can follow, or worse, dishonor. The wife of a samurai does not idle. She manages the home, oversees servants, and trains the daughters in etiquette. She writes poetry, tends to the garden, arranges flowers. Not for aesthetics, but for discipline. Ikebana, the art of flower arrangement, is not creative expression. It's control. Every stem cut to size, every blossom facing a direction, every vase placement echoing harmony with nature. Meanwhile, let's shift to the home of a peasant family. The walls are made of wood and straw, roof patched with old cloth and bamboo. The smell of earth is permanent. A family of 5 sleeps in a space no bigger than a closet. The mother wakes before dawn to heat water. The father straps woven sandals and heads to the fields. Children help carry tools or herd animals. Their meals are modest. Millet porridge, wild greens, perhaps a boiled egg if they're lucky. There are no luxuries, but there is order. And within that order, there is peace. Across the road, an artisan sharpens a blade. He has done this every day for 12 years. The whetstone is smooth from wear. He knows every notch of the steel. He doesn't speak while working. His son watches in silence, learning not through words, but through rhythm. To him, the clang of metal is lullaby. The smell of oil, familiar. In the town center, a merchant opens his stall. He bows to every customer, even if they buy nothing. His robes are plain, despite his wealth. He doesn't look the samurai in the eye. He lowers his head, even if he earns more than them in a month, because in Japan, wealth is not worth without humility. Let's visit a tea house, not a casual cafe, a sanctuary. Guests remove shoes, enter slowly, and bow to the host. The tea is prepared in silence. Every motion is deliberate. The scooping of powdered matcha, the stirring with a bamboo whisk, the the turning of the cup twice before drinking. You don't just drink tea, you experience it. And in that moment, even warlords and peasants become equals, just for the length of a sip. The seasons rule the mood of the land. In spring, cherry blossoms fall like whispers. People gather under pink trees to write poems on rice paper. In summer, the heat is broken by paper fans and cool river baths. In autumn, crimson leaves scatter across stone paths. In winter, homes smell of smoke and miso. Nature is not outside, it is part of the self. And through it all, one thread remains: control, not to suppress joy, but to shape it, not to silence pain, but to carry it with grace. In feudal Japan, life wasn't about victory, it was about balance between duty and desire, between beauty and burden, between breathing and being watched. Let's step deeper into the samurai's world, not just his robe or rituals, but his mind. At the heart of this class lay a single word: Bushido, the way of the warrior. But Bushido wasn't a law written in scrolls. It was a code etched into the marrow of every samurai. Honor above all, duty over desire, death before disgrace. A samurai did not fear death. He rehearsed it daily. In bowing, in stillness, in the long stares into nothing, he prepared to be nothing. When a samurai failed his duty or brought shame to his name, there was only one path left: seppuku, ritual suicide. It was not done in darkness. It was not a scream into the void. It was staged, sacred, and witnessed. The samurai would dress in white, the color of death. He would kneel on a clean mat, often in a garden or chamber. He would write his final poem, a death verse, usually about nature, time, or impermanence. Then, using a short blade, he would cut his own stomach in a left-to-right motion, painful, slow, but honorable. Sometimes a second would stand behind him, a close friend or apprentice, ready to deliver a final sword stroke to the neck, offering mercy once the ritual had been honored. This was called the Kai Shakunin. Even in death, form mattered. Now look beyond the samurai to the battlefield. Samurai didn't charge like wild men. They announced their names. They shouted their lineage. Before a duel, each would declare his father, his master, and his province. Battle was personal. To kill was not rage. It was art. Duels weren't always fought to death, but when they were, it was swift and clean. No wasted motion, no screams, just silence after steel. And if a samurai lost, not just his life, but his reputation, his name might be erased from records, as if he never existed. And yet not every warrior was born noble. Over time, some peasants rose to become famed swordsmen. They trained in secret, studied stolen scrolls, fought in wars, and earned the right to carry the blade. These ronin, masterless samurai, walked alone, feared, respected, sometimes hired as bodyguards, sometimes as assassins. Without a lord, they were both free and cursed. Some lived by Bushido still, others bent it to survive. One such name rises above all: Miyamoto Musashi, a ronin who fought over 60 duels and never lost. He believed in two swords, the katana and the wakizashi, wielded at once. He taught that the way of the sword was the way of life. His book, The Book of Five Rings, became a guide not just for war, but for wisdom. He lived in caves, slept with his armor on, painted and wrote in his final years, embracing stillness after a life of motion. Now, step away from the sword and look at the stage. Yes, the literal stage. In a world so bound by formality, performance was one of the few releases. No theater. Masked, slow, poetic. Every step choreographed, every word drawn out like breath. Performers moved like spirits, faces hidden beneath painted masks. The audience didn't applaud. They watched in stillness, absorbing sorrow and meaning without motion. Then came kabuki, loud, wild, colorful. Actors with painted faces, movements exaggerated, music pounding like a heartbeat. It was the common people's drama, Stories of lovers, warriors, betrayal, and gods. Women were banned from performing, so men played all roles, often with stunning grace. These stages were a mirror to life, distorted but honest. And behind those stages, in brothels and tea houses, lived the geisha. Not courtesans, not wives, something in between, trained from a young age in music, dance, conversation, and etiquette. Their power lay in their performance, not their body. A geisha could silence a room with one glance, pour tea like a prayer, laugh in a way that made generals tremble. But their lives were not glamorous, and hours of preparation, faces painted in layers, posture never relaxed, shoes too small, smiles practiced, and among them, hidden sometimes in the folds of society, were spies, ninja, shinobi, not as common as stories suggest, and not dressed in black. They blended in as farmers, monks, merchants. Their weapons were silence, disguise, misdirection, smoke bombs, throwing stars, poisons. They were hired to gather secrets, disrupt plans, even assassinate, but their honor was debated. To a samurai, stealth was cowardice, but to a lord desperate to win, a shinobi was salvation. Most ninja were born in the Iga and Koga regions, trained in mountain paths, breathing control, survival. Not every tale is true, but some truths were sharper than fiction. Even religion in feudal Japan followed this duality. Shinto, the way of the gods, focused on nature, spirits, and purity. Shrines were built under trees, beside rivers, near stones. Worship was soft, offerings of rice, coins, prayers, no sermons, just silence. And then there was Buddhism, imported, adapted, intertwined. Zen Buddhism, in particular, resonated with samurai. It taught that enlightenment came not from answers, but from questions. From the sound of a bell, from the fall of a leaf, from a sword stroke in silence. And so the samurai meditated not just to be calm, but to be precise. Every motion was a lesson, every stillness a test. Even the tea ceremony, the garden rake, the ink brush became ways to refine the soul. In the hush between wars and rituals, there was the soft, constant thread of nature. Feudal Japan was not only a world of men and swords, it was a land where the wind was a teacher, the seasons were sacred scrolls, and the mountains held memory. The cherry blossom, for example, wasn't just admired for beauty, it symbolized life itself, brief, bright, and always falling too soon. Samurai would sit beneath blooming sakura and write poems about death, not to invite it, but to greet it like a known guest. The Japanese people read the earth like a diary. Autumn leaves weren't debris, they were parting words. Snow on rooftops wasn't just weather, it was a blanket of reflection. Even silence held weight. In the tea garden, a single fallen leaf could shift the meaning of the ceremony. In poetry, the space between words mattered as much as the words themselves. Life wasn't a race, it was a still pond, stirred by small ripples, and in those ripples lived the family. A samurai's home wasn't loud or chaotic, it was arranged, rehearsed, almost sacred. Children didn't run through the house, they glided, they bowed, they listened. Obedience was not demanded, it was expected before it could even be taught. Fathers were distant but always watching. Mothers were quiet anchors, never faltering. Grandparents, if present, were revered as living scrolls. Their advice was rarely spoken directly, but given through proverbs, glances, and the way they folded their hands. Education was not a right, but a responsibility. Samurai children learned not just to read and write, but to observe, to wait, to understand their place. Every scroll unrolled was a lesson. Every ink stroke was a mirror. Boys learned the way of the sword and the way of restraint. Girls learned the art of hospitality, poetry, and silence, not out of suppression, but because silence in this world was its own kind of speech. And outside the samurai walls, the peasant children learned from the land how to hear rain before it came, how to feel the soil with bare feet, and know if the harvest would be kind, how to catch a fish with thread and bone. Their lessons came not in scrolls, but in scars and seasons, and in those fields there was laughter, brief but real, laughter that echoed off rice paddies and was soaked up by muddy clothes and aching hands. Even festivals were layered with both celebration and structure. During Obon, lanterns floated down rivers to guide ancestral spirits back to the other world. Families danced in circles, slow, repeated movements passed down for centuries. Fireworks bloomed above wooden rooftops, but even those sparks seemed to know when to fade. Everything, even joy, bowed before timing. And what of love? In feudal Japan, love was quiet, often unspoken, a glance across a room, a shared teacup, a letter written in brushstroke and left beneath a rock. Marriages were arranged but not always cold. Affection bloomed slowly through service, through sacrifice. A wife rising early to warm her husband's robe, a husband bringing home a single flower from a distant field. Romance was not sung. It was felt in the careful placement of a cup or the softness of closing a door. For those outside, the casts, merchants, entertainers, and wanderers, life offered freedom, but also uncertainty. A wandering musician might trade a song for shelter. A traveling monk might eat once a day and sleep under temple eaves. These people lived on the edge of structure, neither fully inside nor fully cast out. Some found peace in that, others only longing. Justice in feudal Japan was equally poetic and brutal. Steal a handful of rice and you might lose a hand. Disobey a lord and your family name could be wiped from existence. But justice was also slow. Trials weren't rushed. Punishments were public, not just to harm, but to warn. In some villages, a single bell ringing at dusk meant a thief had been caught. In others, white banners marked the home of someone awaiting judgment. At the center of all these systems was one invisible thread: shame. Shame was more powerful than prison. It outlived bruises, or it could drive a person to exile, to silence, or to death. A father's shame could haunt a grandson. A single mistake could become a family ghost, but honor once lost could sometimes be regained, not with words, but with a lifetime of quiet correction. Nature, too, had its punishments. Earthquakes were sudden, common, and always humbling. Fires tore through wooden towns in hours. Floods reshaped entire villages. But the people rebuilt, not because they believed they could control the earth, but because they knew they couldn't. Temples were rebuilt again and again. Nature, too, had its punishments. Earthquakes were sudden, common, and always humbling. Fires tore through wooden towns in hours. Floods reshaped entire villages. But the people rebuilt, not because they believed they could control the earth, but because they knew they couldn't. Temples were rebuilt again and again, not to defy time, but to make peace with it. Religion wasn't loud here. There were no thunderous sermons, just soft footsteps on shrine path, a coin dropped in offering, the clink of a bell, paper prayers fluttering in the wind. A child might write a wish on a wooden plaque and hang it on a sacred tree, not expecting it to come true, but offering it anyway, as a whisper to the universe. And through all of it, there was art. Art not for gallery walls, but for everyday life. A rice bowl with a crack filled in gold, because the flaw made it beautiful. A scroll painted with ink and breath, read only by candlelight. A doorway placed just off-center to remind the guest that perfection was never the goal. This was wabi-sabi, the beauty of impermanence, of incompleteness, a lesson carved into wood, stitched into robes, brewed into tea. Toward the later centuries of the feudal era, whispers began to ripple through the still surface of tradition. trade winds shifted. Foreign sails appeared on the horizon. The old layers, emperor, shogun, daimyo, samurai, peasant, remained in place, but the edges started to crack. The rituals continued, the bows still deep, the gardens still pruned. But beyond the hills, the world had begun to change. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive in Japan in the mid 1500s. They brought firearms, Christianity, and curiosity. Matchlock guns changed the face of combat. Daimyos, who once relied solely on samurai blades, now trained peasants in gunfire. The old ways frowned, but they could not deny the sound of gunpowder. It was louder than steel. Christian missionaries followed, Jesuits in black robes, carrying crosses instead of swords. Some Japanese converted quietly at first. New prayers echoed through coastal villages. Churches rose where shrines once stood. But with new faith came tension. The shogunate watched, wary. They saw loyalty not to the emperor, but to a foreign god. And when suspicion turned to fear, the crackdown was swift. Christianity was banned. Converts were hunted. Symbols of foreign religion were buried or burned. Meanwhile, internal unrest brewed. Peasant uprisings flared when taxes rose too high. The Shimabara Rebellion was the loudest, a revolt of Christian peasants and Ronin against the Tokugawa shogunate. It was crushed brutally, tens of thousands killed. It sent a clear message: Japan would be ruled by Japanese hands and no other. So the gates closed, literally. The Tokugawa shogunate implemented sakoku, closed country. No foreigner could enter, no Japanese could leave. Trade was restricted to a few controlled ports. For over 200 years, Japan sealed itself off. The samurai returned to their scrolls. The temples breathed easier. The cherry blossoms fell again without foreign eyes watching. But isolation couldn't stop time. By the 1800s, the world had grown louder. Steamships, railroads, colonial ambitions, and then came the black ships. Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet from America. They arrived in 1853 demanding trade, demanding answers. Their cannons weren't metaphor, their intentions were clear. Japan signed treaties, ports opened, Western clothes appeared. Samurai looked at rifles and wondered about their place. The sword that had defined 1,000 years now looked fragile beside a bullet. The samurai class, once revered, feared, obeyed, began to fade. Some adapted, joined the new government, became officials. Others resisted, clinging to Bushido like a ghost cloak. One of the last echoes of this era was the Satsuma Rebellion. A group of samurai, led by Saigo Takamori, rose against the new Meiji government. They fought not just with weapons, but with memory, with the belief that honor still mattered, but memory isn't armor. They were defeated. Saigo died, by seppuku, some say, and with him the old age exhaled its final breath. Yet not all was lost. The essence of the samurai lived on, not in battlefields, but in schools, in hearts. Their discipline became part of Japanese identity. Bushido influenced corporate culture, martial arts, even cinema. The tea ceremony remained. The gardens were still raked, the ink still flowed, and so, while the castles crumbled and the blacksmiths turned to factories, something remained. The silence, the awareness, the thread that says, life is fleeting and yet worth shaping with grace. A bowl, a brushstroke, a bow. Even as the modern world thundered in, the people bowed, not in surrender, but in remembrance. Because feudal Japan was never truly about power. It was about presence, a kind of stillness that survives even now, in gestures, in architecture, in how a child learns to pour tea. The sword may be sheathed forever, but the hand that once held it still remembers how to move with honor. As the old era of feudal silence gives way to the distant thunder of change, a new figure steps forth from history's shadows, Artemisia of Caria. Unlike the rigid order of Japan, her realm is one of shifting alliances and turbulent seas. A queen by birth and a warrior by will, she defies the conventional roles. set for women in a world ruled by men. In a land where loyalty is demanded by blood and lineage is both a blessing and a curse, Artemisia carves her own path with a blend of determination, cunning, and unparalleled bravery. Born in a coastal principality where the waves of the Aegean met the ancient traditions of Korea, Artemisia was no ordinary ruler. From a young age, she witnessed the brutal politics of war and the fragility of power. She learned that a crown, no matter how heavy, could be worn as a mantle of duty and defiance. Her early years were marked by lessons from both the battlefield and the throne, where strategy was as essential as compassion, and where the art of war was written in the ink of sacrifice. In her adolescence, the winds of conflict grew fierce. The Persian Empire, expanding its reach, set its eyes on the Greek city-states, and alliances were thrown into chaos. Amidst this turmoil, Artemisia emerged as a remarkable force, rejecting the expectation that a woman should fade into the background of diplomacy. She rallied warriors and built a small but resolute fleet. Her leadership was not gentle. It was forged by necessity and honed by the crucible of battle. Every command she uttered resonated with a clarity that belied the fear and uncertainty of war. The turning point came during a tense naval encounter, a moment when the fate of her people hung in the balance. As the Persian fleet advanced and the Greek forces watched from the narrow straits, Artemisia took a bold risk, commanding her flagship with the calm of one who has seen death before. She steered her ship into the heart of enemy lines. With strategic precision, she ordered her vessel to ram an allied ship of the Persians. This unexpected move sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks, momentarily confusing the Greeks, who suddenly found themselves unsure of friend from foe. Such was her audacity and tactical genius that even King Xerxes could only murmur in disbelief, acknowledging her prowess as a warrior queen. The battle raged, and although many of her contemporaries would have chosen caution, Artemisia pressed forward. She was not content merely to survive. She sought to turn the tide of history. Her actions on the battlefield were a blend of calculated risk and sheer defiance, a statement that a woman could command respect through force of will and intellect. Every maneuver, every command was a lesson in strategy. In her eyes burned the light of a leader determined to protect her people, to defy these expectations of a patriarchal order, and to etch her name in the annals of history with the strokes of her sword. Yet behind the martial triumphs lay a complex character. Artemisia was as much a scholar as a soldier. In moments of quiet between clashes, she studied the art of rhetoric, philosophy, and the delicate balance between aggression and restraint. Her court became a haven for intellectuals and warriors alike, a place where poetry mingled with plans of conquest, where debates on honor and duty were as common as the clashing of swords. Here, she nurtured a belief that true leadership was not about overpowering one's enemies, but about inspiring loyalty through the relentless pursuit of justice and wisdom. Her rise was not without sacrifice. Many doubted her claims. Many denounced her for daring to take charge in a realm where only men were supposed to hold power. Critics whispered that her tactics were too bold, her ambitions too wide. Yet every defeat she endured only steeled her resolve. Every setback sharpened her strategies. In time, even those who once scorned her began to see the method in her defiant madness. A queen who had transformed personal tragedy into a rallying cry for her people. As the legacy of feudal order gradually faded, Artemisia's story lit a beacon of possibility. In a world where roles were predetermined, she had rewritten the rules. Not merely surviving, she thrived, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for future leaders, inspiring generations that true strength lies in embracing one's unique destiny, regardless of convention. Artemisia's reputation did not exist in isolation. Every legend needs both allies and adversaries to test its truth, and her rise unfolded in a world tangled in the politics of empires. As the Persian Empire stretched its vast hand across land and sea, it found many willing to serve and many who refused to kneel. Artemisia, though aligned with the Persians, was not their puppet. She walked a razor's edge, serving Xerxes with loyalty, but never surrendering her identity as the queen of Halicarnassus. Among her few equals stood Mardonius, a respected Persian general, whose tactical mind often clashed with hers. While Mardonius favored overwhelming force, Artemisia believed in deception and speed. Their debates were silent battles, exchanged through cold glances across war tables and the weighted silence of strategy chambers. Yet even he had to admit that her success on the sea came not from luck, but from intellect few could match. The other Persian commanders eyed her with both awe and suspicion. She was a woman, yes, but more dangerously, she was right, more often than they were. And then there were her enemies, the Greeks, fierce in their defense of liberty, proud of their city-states, united only when threatened. To them, Artemisia was a paradox, a woman who led fleets, who fought for a foreign king, but whose tactics mirrored the sharpness of their own greatest minds. She became a name whispered in fear and fascination. Spartan commanders studied her movements. Athenian orators spoke her name with begrudging respect. They knew she could not be ignored. In the Battle of Salamis, one of the most decisive naval conflicts of the era, Artemisia's legacy was carved in wind and wave. Xerxes watched from the cliffs above as his navy collided with the cunning of the Greeks. The sea boiled with fire and shattered wood. Amid this chaos, Artemisia made her most controversial decision. Pursued by a Greek trireme and unable to escape, she ordered her ship to ram and sink another Persian vessel to fool the Greeks into thinking she was one of them. The ruse worked. The Greek ship backed off. From the cliffs, Xerxes saw the destruction and assumed her enemy had fallen. He turned to his advisors and declared, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." It was both a compliment and a condemnation of the commanders who had failed where Artemisia had prevailed. While many Persian ships sank, hers returned intact. Some called it betrayal. Others called it brilliance. This moment defined her. It wasn't the blood spilled or the fire in her sails. It was the ability to turn desperation into deception, and deception into victory. Artemisia didn't fight for glory. She fought for survival, for sovereignty, and for the honor of leading as she chose. She wasn't trying to be a man. She was trying to be herself, fully, fiercely, and unapologetically. But her brilliance made her a target. In court, whispers spread like oil on water. Rivals questioned her methods. Allies grew nervous of her influence. She returned to Halicarnassus a hero, but also a symbol of uncomfortable power, proof that a woman with no husband beside her, no father behind her, could outmatch empires with wit alone. In the years that followed, she withdrew slightly from public battles, but remained a guiding force in regional politics. She trained the next generation of naval commanders, often disguising her teachings as questions. Where does fear begin? On the shore or in the sail? Is a weapon stronger or the hand that lets it go? Her legacy grew not only in what she did, but in what she represented. She became a story mothers told their daughters, a name scribed into the walls of temples, a figure that defied time because she had dared to lead, not as a shadow of anyone else, but as the sun at the center of her own path. In the quiet years after the war, Artemisia did not disappear. She simply moved away from the firelight. Battles no longer thundered beneath her feet, but the world still listened. From the carved marble halls of Halicarnassus to the outer edges of Persian rule. Her name traveled in whispers, poems, and uneasy admiration. She had become more than queen, more than warrior. She had become symbol, and with that came the weight of myth, the loneliness of memory. She ruled her coastal city with a firm but fair hand. Trade flourished under her watch. Sailors whispered blessings to her name before setting off. Children who had once feared the sea now dreamed of ships because the sea had once bowed to her. But peace, while precious, came with shadows. Artemisia had spent her life in motion, surviving storms of both blade and betrayal. To sit still was a different kind of battle. She began to walk the city walls alone at dawn, wrapped in a dark cloak, the salt wind tugging at her hair. Some said she was watching for another war. Others said she was looking for something she had lost, perhaps a brother killed in battle or a vision of herself before the scars. In these quiet hours, she often visited the tombs of sailors, reading their epitaphs in silence. She left no flowers, only pebbles, each one placed with intention, a memory, a lesson, a farewell. One of the most enduring tales of her final years comes not from war, but from love and loss. Legend holds that Artemisia fell in love with a young warrior who never returned her affection. He died in battle, and in grief, she ordered his remains to be brought back to her city. But what she did next split historians into camps of disbelief and awe. Some say she drank a potion made from his ashes, believing that by doing so, he would live on inside her. Others claim it was metaphor, that she merely consumed the grief and wore it as armor for the rest of her life. Whatever the truth, it marked her. Her eyes, once sharp as sails catching wind, grew softer, deeper, not broken, just weathered. She no longer spoke in commands. She asked questions. What becomes of the storm when the sails are folded? Who remembers the wave after it's gone? She built libraries, sponsored poets, preserved the sea charts that had once guided her to victory. Her palace walls were filled not with trophies, but with scrolls, maps of currents, records of wind patterns, drawings of every ship she had ever commanded. Her legacy shifted from steel to ink, from storm to stillness. Eventually, time did what no army could. It wore her down. Her hair turned silver. Her walk slowed. She stopped attending council meetings and began spending more time by the shore. She watched the waves come and go, each one a reminder of what she had been and what she had chosen not to become. A tyrant, a conqueror, a name lost in blood. One morning, her servants found her chambers empty, her sandals neatly placed by the door, her cloak missing. On the bed, only a single folded scroll. No one saw her again. Some believe she walked into the sea, returning to the one force that had always listened. Others say she boarded a quiet boat and sailed into obscurity, choosing a final journey no one could follow. But her city did not forget. Statues were raised, her likeness etched into coins, her story told around fires and in schoolrooms. Not just as queen or warrior, but as woman, complex, fierce, flawed, and unyielding in her will to live by her own command. Today, when sailors from the Mediterranean set out under moonlight, some still whisper her name to the tide, not to summon protection, but to honor a woman who led not because she was allowed to, but because she refused not to. As the tides of the Mediterranean carried away the echoes of Artemisia's last voyage, another voice from the sands of time rises, one not of command or conquest, but of mystery. The boy who became a god, the child who ruled an empire. His name, Tutankhamun, and though his reign was brief and his deeds modest, he would become one of the most famous pharaohs in all of Egyptian history, not for how he lived, but for how he was found. Tutankhamun ascended the throne around 1332 BCE, likely at the age of 9. His name meant living image of Amun, a signal of religious restoration after the radical reforms of his father, Akhenaten. Egypt had been torn from its spiritual roots. Temples stood empty. The sun god, Aten, had replaced the ancient pantheon, and priests, once powerful, had been cast aside. Into this religious chaos stepped a child. He was too young to rule alone, so regents and advisors steered the course. Aye, the elder statesman, Horemheb, the general, priests desperate to restore old order. But even in that puppet court, Tutankhamun's image was central. He wore the crown. He sat on the throne. His youth became a symbol of hope, hope that the gods might forgive the past and bless Egypt once more. He moved the capital back to Thebes. He reinstated the old gods. Temples were rebuilt. Statues destroyed by his father's decree were recarved and raised again. The people, weary from spiritual exile, welcomed this return like water in a drought. Even as the true power rested behind him, Tutankhamun's presence became a balm to the national soul. But his life was not easy. The boy king suffered from multiple ailments: malaria, a clubfoot, and possibly a bone disorder. Pain was his quiet companion, yet in statues and carvings he stood tall, spear in hand, chariot at the ready. His image was perfected, his weakness hidden beneath gold and paint. In truth, he was more fragile than divine, and perhaps that made his legacy more human, more real. He married his half-sister, Ankhesenamun, a union meant to preserve royal bloodlines. They shared sorrow early. Two daughters were stillborn. Their tiny, mummified bodies were found in his tomb centuries later, wrapped in grief. We can only imagine how their loss shaped him. When Howard Carter unsealed the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he didn't just unlock an ancient door. He stirred something that had been asleep for thousands of years. The air inside the tomb was thick, untouched since the boy king's funeral rites. But with that first breath of modern air, stories began to swirl. Whispers, accidents, deaths. A legend took root in the world's imagination. The curse of the Pharaoh. It began with Lord Carnarvon, the man who had funded the excavation. Just months after entering the tomb, he died suddenly from an infected mosquito bite. The press, hungry for spectacle, declared it divine punishment. Lights flickered across Cairo. Carnarvon's dog, they claimed, howled and dropped dead at the exact moment he passed. Rational minds dismissed it, but fear clung to the story like dust to bone. More deaths followed, some tied to the excavation, some not. But all were grouped under one banner, the Pharaoh's curse. It wasn't just newspapers now, it was dinner table conversation, museum exhibit chatter, fireside, tales told in the flicker of candlelight, the idea that ancient kings could reach beyond the grave, that their peace had been disturbed and revenge had begun. It captivated a world already fascinated by the mysteries of Egypt. Yet, while curses grabbed headlines, something deeper had awakened. The treasures found in Tutankhamun's tomb were not just gold, they were time capsules. A folding bed built for war, perfume vials still fragrant, board games, sandals, garments sewn with care. These weren't relics. They were remnants of a life lived, a boy who had laughed, loved, and died too soon. His tomb wasn't just an archaeological site, it was a bedroom sealed in sorrow. Museums scrambled to claim a piece of the wonder. Scholars studied every item. Artists recreated his mask in paintings, sculpture, and film. The world had fallen in love with a boy long dead, not because of what he achieved, but because of what had been preserved. For the first time, the world could see ancient Egypt not as myth, but as memory. Carter himself was methodical, dismissing tales of curses and focusing on cataloging every item with near-obsessive care. Yet even he could not deny the weight of history in that chamber. The eyes of the statues seemed to follow. The silence was not just absence, it was presence, a stillness filled with expectation as though the boy king was watching, waiting to be remembered. And remembered he was. Tutankhamun's discovery sparked a global Egyptomania. Jewelry mimicked his mask. Literature poured over the Valley of the Kings. Children in faraway lands pretended to be pharaohs. Their bedsheets turned to royal robes. But in Egypt, something more solemn stirred, a reckoning with heritage. The world had taken its treasures. Now, it demanded its stories back. Egyptian scholars pushed for the return of artifacts. Exhibitions became political. Who owned the past? The country of birth or the country of discovery? Tutankhamun had become not just a symbol of wonder, but a symbol of reclamation. His tomb whispered a message. You can marvel, but do not forget who I am, where I came from, and why I was buried in silence. Today, his golden mask still draws crowds. His story still inspires awe. But more than that, he represents the fragility of legacy. Not every king leaves behind wars and monuments. Some leave behind a room, a pair of sandals, and a silence that echoes louder than victory. And perhaps that is why Tutankhamun endures. He was not the greatest ruler, but he was real, tender, tragic, and trapped in a history he never chose. And now, through dust and gold, he finally speaks. While Tutankhamun lies in his golden silence, surrounded by fame and fragments of a short life, there are others, far older, far more powerful, whose names the wind does not carry as loudly. Queens who ruled with iron, will, and divine right. Women who raised temples, led armies, brokered peace, and in some cases wore the double crown, not beside a man, but alone. The forgotten queens of the Nile. Chief among them was Hatshepsut. Her name meant foremost of noble women, and she ruled not as a queen consort, but as a pharaoh in her own right. When her husband died, she stepped into power, initially as regent for her young stepson, but gradually she reshaped the court, the titles, and even the iconography. Statues began to show her with the ceremonial beard of kings. She wasn't pretending to be a man. She was reshaping the definition of what a pharaoh could be. Her reign was not marked by war, but by art and architecture. She built the grand mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved into cliffs like a promise to eternity. She opened trade routes, including the legendary expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back incense trees, gold, and animals never before seen in Egypt. Hatshepsut's Egypt flourished. Peace reigned, and the gods seemed content. Yet after her death, her name was nearly erased. Her stepson, Thutmose III, who eventually assumed power, ordered her statues defaced and her cartouches scraped off the temple walls. Why? Perhaps jealousy? Perhaps a belief that a woman had upset the sacred balance. For centuries, she vanished from history until archaeologists pieced her back together like a temple long buried in sand, and she was not alone. There was Nefertiti, whose face survives in one of the most iconic sculptures in the world. Her name means the beautiful one has come, but her legacy runs deeper than beauty. As the wife of Akhenaten, she stood at the heart of one of Egypt's most radical religious revolutions. Together, they elevated the sun god Aten, sidelining the traditional deities. In artwork, she stands beside her husband, not behind him. Sometimes she's shown striking enemies, a role typically reserved for pharaohs. And in her later years, some scholars believe she ruled Egypt alone under a different name, possibly as a male co-regent or even pharaoh in disguise. And then came Cleopatra, last of the Ptolemies, a queen whose name echoes louder than any. Unlike Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, Cleopatra ruled a broken Egypt, a kingdom crumbling beneath Roman pressure. She used diplomacy, charm, and intelligence to navigate a world dominated by empires. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony weren't just romantic, they were political lifelines. Cleopatra spoke multiple languages. She studied philosophy and science. She reformed coinage and law. But Roman writers painted her as a seductress, reducing her mind to a myth. Her death by snake or dagger marked the end of Egypt's independence. With her died the line of pharaohs. These queens, though separated by centuries, shared more than bloodlines. They shared the burden of being women in a man's world, yet they did not bend. They led, they bled, they built. And even when their names were buried, their temples crumbled, and their stories erased, they rose again, uncovered by hands seeking truth beneath layers of sand and time. To study them is not to rewrite history, it is to finish a sentence left incomplete. It is to remember that Egypt's greatness was not only built by kings, but by queens who dared to wear crowns no one offered them. As Cleopatra's body was laid to rest and the serpent's mark became myth, Egypt took its final breath as a sovereign power. With her fall, Rome did not just claim land, it consumed legacy. The once golden land of gods and granite temples became a province of marble. The age of pharaohs gave way to emperors, but the river kept flowing. The Nile, unbothered, continued to carry stories, silt, and spirits. Egypt, under Roman rule, was both reverent and restructured. The Romans, for all their dominance, held deep respect for Egyptian customs. They maintained temples, dressed their statues in local styles, and even adopted Egyptian deities into their own pantheon. Isis, once queen of the Egyptian gods, now had shrines across the Mediterranean. But this was not preservation, it was translation. A culture reinterpreted, its roots slowly shifting beneath foreign soil. The city of Alexandria, once the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world, began to transform. Its famous library, a beacon of knowledge, was now under threat. Fires, wars, neglect. The scrolls that held the wisdom of 1,000 years were turned to ash. The scholars who once debated stars and anatomy vanished. Replaced by governors, taxes, and orders from Rome, Egypt, once the teacher, became the pupil. Yet resistance lived on, not always in war, but in memory. Egyptians still honored their gods, still whispered the old hymns. In quiet corners of temples, priests maintained rituals, even as the empire pulled the threads loose. Art remained, architecture echoed, hieroglyphs still carved, their spirals in stone, even when fewer and fewer could read them. Then came the Christians. Rome converted, and Egypt, once a cradle of polytheistic worship, became a battleground for the new faith. Pagan temples were closed, their gods declared demons. The image of Horus faded beneath the shadow of the cross. Isis became Mary to some. The old myths were not destroyed, they were baptized, rewritten, absorbed. By the time the Arabs arrived in the 7th century, Egypt had already changed faces many times, yet its spirit endured. Arabic replaced Coptic, which had replaced Greek, which had replaced Demotic, which had replaced the hieroglyphs. But through every transformation, one thing remained constant: the land itself, the desert, the river, the monuments that refused to fall. The pyramids, silent and proud, still watched the sky. The Sphinx, wind-worn and half-buried, still guarded its secrets. Farmers still planted with the rhythm of the Nile's flood, a cycle older than any crown. Tourists came, conquerors left, but Egypt stayed. Even Napoleon, when he marched into the land centuries later, did not see a battlefield. He saw a museum, a living relic. He brought scholars, not just soldiers. Long before pyramids rose or prophets walked, there was a land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Here, in the cradle of civilization, humanity took its first structured breath. It was not gold or war that defined Mesopotamia, but something quieter and more permanent: writing, law, cities, and time itself. The Sumerians were among the first. They carved their lives into clay tablets, each wedge-shaped mark a whisper from 5,000 years ago. Cuneiform, the world's first written script, was not born of poetry, but of record-keeping, grain, trade, land. But as it evolved, it captured myths, prayers, and laws. Stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale of kingship, gods, and mortality, emerged from the dust, revealing a world both foreign and familiar. Their cities were organized, walled, and crowned with ziggurats, massive step towers reaching toward the sky, not merely temples, but cosmic ladders. The gods, they believed, lived among them, demanded order, and watched through the stars. Each city had its patron deity. Uruk had Inanna, goddess of love and war. Nippur bowed to Enlil, lord of air and storms. But Mesopotamia was not a single empire. It was a mosaic of rising and falling city-states. Power passed like a river current from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to Assyria. Kings carved their names into stone, building empires of ambition. One such man was Sargon of Akkad, who forged the first multi-city empire, uniting disparate voices into a single tongue of power. Yet it was Hammurabi, king of Babylon, who offered something more lasting than conquest. The world's earliest surviving legal code. Inscribed on a stone pillar, it declared, "An eye for an eye." Justice was born in stone. Harsh, yes, but structured. The idea that actions had consequences, that society needed laws, would ripple through time. Mesopotamian science flourished. They divided the day into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes. They tracked stars, plotted the moon's phases, and created lunar calendars. Mathematics wasn't theory, it was practical. For building walls, measuring fields, and calculating debts, these ancient accountants shaped the very way we now measure reality. Their gods were many, and their world was not kind. Floods, droughts, and invading armies defined their lives. In their myths, humans were created to serve the gods, to ease divine burdens. Prayer was obligation, not comfort. Temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were banks, warehouses, schools. Despite their brilliance, Mesopotamian civilizations were vulnerable. No natural borders, frequent wars. When the Assyrians rose, they did so with iron and terror. Their empire stretched far, their kings boasting of conquered cities and flayed enemies. Yet even they fell, consumed by rebellion and invasion, their stone lions buried in sand. Later came Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon. He built the famed Hanging Gardens, or so legend says. Some believe they never existed. Others swear they were a miracle of ancient engineering. Either way, Babylon became synonymous with grandeur and excess, a city of color, ceremony, and complexity. But like all who rise too high, Babylon fell. Persia came, then Greece, then Rome, and the rivers that once cradled empires began to carry away their names. Yet beneath modern Iraq, those layers remain. Thousands of years of tablets, tools, temples. We have barely scratched the surface. Every excavation brings new names, new laws, new voices, once silenced by mud and fire. And Mesopotamia gave us cities, scripts, systems, and showed that civilization is not a straight line. It rises, falls, and rises again. It is fragile, precious, and worth. While Mesopotamia was carving stories into clay and Egypt was raising temples to the sun, another civilization thrived, quiet, orderly, and vastly misunderstood. The Indus Valley civilization, centered in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, rose around 2600 BCE. It left no kings to worship, no war memorials, no triumphant epics. Only bricks, seals, and silence. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of planning. Streets ran in straight lines, wide and intersecting. Homes were built with standardized fired bricks. There were wells, drainage systems, even what many believe were public baths, not for luxury, but for ritual, cleanliness. Some buildings were 2 stories high. This wasn't just survival, it was society, scaled and precise. What makes the Indus unique is its absence of drama. No grand palaces, no towering ziggurats, no evidence of a ruling elite. Artifacts show a remarkably uniform culture. Weights, measures, pottery, even seals with animals, and undeciphered script all reflect a civilization more cooperative than conquering. Power, if it existed, left no monuments to ego. The seals are among their most enduring mysteries. Made of steatite, pressed with animals, bulls, elephants, unicorn-like creatures, and lined with symbols, possibly a language. But to this day, the Indus script remains undeciphered. Without a Rosetta Stone, the civilization's voice remains locked away, its thoughts unread, its prayers silent. Artifacts suggest a people deeply connected to nature and trade. They exported beads, lapis lazuli, and cotton textiles as far as Mesopotamia. In return, they received silver, tin, and ideas. They were not isolated, they were part of the ancient world's web, but with their own rhythm. Religious life is speculative. Some terracotta figurines resemble later Hindu deities, a proto-Shiva perhaps, sitting cross-legged, surrounded by animals. Trees seem sacred, so do rivers. But without texts, we're left with gestures, not doctrines. And then it vanished. Around 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley began to decline, not with fire or war, but with a slow retreat. Rivers shifted, floods came, trade routes collapsed. Some cities were abandoned, others dwindled. There is little sign of violence, no skeletons in streets, no enemy inscriptions, just silence. A civilization that faded like mist, not thunder. Theories abound: climate change, earthquakes, disease, overuse of resources. Whatever the cause, the Indus didn't fall, it dispersed. Its people likely migrated eastward, blending into emerging cultures of the Ganges Plain. The Vedic age would follow, and with it, a new chapter of Indian history. But the Indus still lives, in the beads unearthed by farmers, in the wells that mirror modern ones, in the bricks used by villages today, cut to the same ancient ratio, and in the mystery. For the Indus Valley remains one of the few major civilizations whose language and stories have not yet spoken. It reminds us that greatness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, builds in straight lines, and then walks away, leaving questions instead of answers. While the Nile whispered to its gods and the Indus flowed past silent streets, another river stirred to life. The Yellow River, Huanghe, winding through northern China, was not just a source of water, but of memory, myth, and monarchy. From its fertile basin rose one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, shaping dynasties that would last for millennia. The earliest known dynasty is the Xia, shrouded in legend. Some historians debate whether it truly existed or was an invention of later rulers to legitimize their power. Still, the stories endure of Emperor Yu the Great, who tamed the floods, carved canals with his bare hands, and turned chaos into order. Whether man or myth, his name echoes the Chinese ideal: harmony between heaven, earth, and ruler. More concrete was the Shang dynasty, rising around 1600 BCE. With it came bronze, weapons, tools, vessels. The Shang were master metal workers, casting intricate ceremonial pieces for offerings and ancestors. They believed the spirits of the dead influenced the living. Kings were not just rulers, but intermediaries. Communication with the divine came through oracle bones, pieces of ox shoulder or turtle shell. Questions were carved into them, then heated until they cracked. The patterns were interpreted as messages from the gods. These bones are our window into their world, asking about crops, battles, childbirth, and storms, simple concerns, timeless fears. It's among the earliest forms of Chinese writing, the ancestor of modern characters still used today. In these fragments, the voice of ancient China stirs. The Shang built walled cities, practiced ritual sacrifice, and maintained a strict hierarchy. At the top stood the king. Beneath him, nobles, warriors, artisans, and farmers. At the bottom, slaves. Their cities were often laid out in cosmological patterns, mirroring the heavens, aligning earth to stars. Order wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Then came the Zhou dynasty around 1046 BCE. They overthrew the Shang and introduced a concept that would guide China's rulers for centuries: the mandate of heaven. Power, they said, was granted by divine approval. But if a ruler became cruel or failed his people, heaven would withdraw its blessing. Natural disasters, famine, or rebellion weren't random. They were signs the dynasty had lost its virtue. It was a powerful idea. Kings ruled not by blood alone, but by merit, and it gave people a moral lens through which to judge their leaders. The early Zhou period saw stability and growth. Iron tools improved farming. Literature began to flourish. But slowly, unity frayed. By 770 BCE, the Zhou entered their later phase, a time of internal division known as the Spring and Autumn period, followed by the Warring States period. Feudal lords fought for dominance, philosophers debated truth, and the land fractured. It was during this chaos that some of China's greatest minds emerged. Confucius, who preached ethics, duty, and social harmony. Laozi, the mystical voice of the Tao, who urged stillness, surrender, and balance with nature. Together, they built the spiritual and philosophical backbone of China, one rooted not in gods but in conduct. The warring states were brutal. Alliances broken, cities burned, millions lost. But from the ashes rose a new power, the Qin, and with it the idea of empire. Yet long before emperors claimed divine right, long before dragons adorned palaces, it was the river that birthed them all. The Yellow River, both blessing and burden, flooded fields and fed empires. Its silt built cities. Its wrath toppled kings. Ancient China reminds us that civilization is not just conquest or monuments, it is belief, it is order, it is the struggle to find balance between man and sky, chaos and control, tradition and change. From the blood-soaked fields of the warring states rose a single unyielding power, the Qin dynasty. Short-lived, ruthless, and transformative. At its center stood a man who would change the course of history, Yingzheng, and later known as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. By 221 BCE, he had conquered the rival kingdoms and done what no ruler before him had dared: unify China. He abolished feudal states, centralized power, standardized currency, weights, roads, even the written script. From the chaotic patchwork of warlords, he forged one empire under one law. Efficiency became sacred, dissent became dangerous. His rule was absolute. Dissenters were silenced. Books were burned, especially those of Confucian scholars who questioned authority. Some were buried alive. To Qin Shi Huang, knowledge that challenged unity was poison. He wasn't building a kingdom, he was building a legacy meant to outlast the sky, and so he built. He ordered the construction of massive roads stretching thousands of miles, connecting his empire like veins. He expanded fortifications in the north, an early precursor to what would become the Great Wall of China. Though crude compared to later versions, it stood as a barrier between civilization and the steppe raiders, and as a symbol of China's resolve. But his most ambitious project lay beneath the ground, his tomb, near the modern city of Xi'an. Workers toiled in secret to build a resting place, worthy of a god. Thousands of life-sized terracotta warriors were crafted, each with unique features: soldiers, generals, horses, chariots, archers. They were arranged in battle formation, buried underground to guard him in the afterlife. Rivers of mercury were said to flow through his tomb, mimicking the great rivers of China. The tomb itself remains unopened, shrouded in legend and fear. Despite these achievements, Qin Shi Huang ruled with fear. He survived assassination attempts, grew increasingly paranoid, and sought immortality. He consumed mercury based elixirs meant to grant eternal life, ironically hastening his death in 210 BCE. Without him, the Qin dynasty crumbled within years. Harsh laws, heavy taxes, and forced labor had bred resentment. Rebels rose, and the Han dynasty soon took its place. But the idea of a unified China, born in fire and fear, endured. The legacy of Qin Shi Huang is complex. Some see a tyrant who crushed freedom. Others see a visionary who laid the foundation for 2,000 years of imperial rule. Both are true. He was the storm that cleared the path, the architect of a nation, the ghost behind the walls. And warriors, the terracotta army still stands, silent, watchful. Not just a monument to one man, but a reminder that empires are built not only with stone and steel, but with silence, sacrifice, and stories that never die. From here, China would shift into the age of the Han, where intellect would bloom, borders would expand, and the Silk Road would stir. But before we walk that road, we pause at the tomb of a man who believed he could rule death itself. When the iron grip of the Qin loosened, chaos returned. But from that storm emerged a dynasty that would last 4 centuries and shape the soul of China, the Han Dynasty. Founded by Liu Bang, a commoner who rose through rebellion, the Han brought balance where the Qin had brought fear. They honored law, but welcomed learning, and through them, China blossomed. The early Han emperors restored Confucianism. Scholars once buried under the Qin were now invited to advise the throne. Morality, respect, order, these became guiding principles. Education flourished. The imperial examination system, though still young, began taking root. An idea that talent, not birth, should define a leader. A quiet revolution. Under Emperor Wu, the Han reached its zenith. He expanded the empire westward, pushing borders deep into the Central Asia, Korea, and Vietnam. But conquest was not his only gift. He established state monopolies in salt and iron, built canals, minted coins, and sent envoys far beyond the mountains. Among them was Zhang Qian, whose journeys opened a trail that would become legend. The Silk Road. It was not a single path, but a web of routes that stretched from Chang'an to Rome. Through deserts and oases, over mountains, and across empires, caravans carried silk, spices, paper, jade, glass, gold, and more importantly, ideas. Buddhism from India, art from Persia, techniques from the West, cultures touched, traded, and transformed. Back home, the Han built cities with bustling markets, workshops, and libraries. The court kept time with water clocks. Astronomers charted the skies with precision. Doctors practiced acupuncture, recorded illnesses, and experimented with herbs. Seismographs detected distant quakes. Paper, invented in this era, changed record keeping forever. Women had limited rights, but figures like Ban Zhao, a historian and scholar, broke through boundaries. Her writings taught etiquette and education for women, not just obedience. In an empire run by men, her voice endured. But even golden ages crack. Court intrigues festered. Eunuchs and consort clans vied for power. The rich grew richer. The poor, burdened by taxes and drought, rose in rebellion. The Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 CE signaled the beginning of the end. Regional warlords seized power. The dynasty split and splintered. By 220 CE, the Han had fallen, but its shadow stretched across centuries. The Chinese would forever call themselves the Han people. Its values, inventions, and stories became the cultural spine of a civilization. The Han showed that an empire need not be built solely on fear or force. It could rise through wisdom, curiosity, and connection. It could teach as much as it ruled, and though it ended, its pulse remains, in characters still written, in philosophies still taught, and in silk that once caught the wind between worlds, while silk caravans threaded east to west, and dynasties rose along the Yellow River. Another power was stirring, one that would not trade silk but steel. That power was Rome, not born in palaces or temples, but in myth. Two brothers, Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf, raised among shepherds and destined to found a city that would claim the world. Rome began as a republic, a system of checks, senates, and citizen soldiers. For centuries, they fought, neighbors absorbed allies, and slowly stretched their borders. But it was ambition, chaos, and civil war that birthed an empire. The republic cracked under its own weight. Out of the ashes rose one man, Gaius Octavius, heir to Julius Caesar, who took the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. With him, the Roman Empire was born. Augustus was more than a conqueror. He was a builder. He reformed laws, stabilized the currency, expanded roads, and created a professional army loyal to the state. He ushered in the Pax Romana, a 200-year span of relative peace where trade thrived, cities flourished, and roads stretched like veins across continents. At its peak, Rome controlled lands from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian border. 1 million people lived in Rome, an urban marvel. Aqueducts brought water from distant hills. Public baths, amphitheaters, libraries, and temples dotted the cityscape. The Colosseum, with its blood-soaked sand and towering arches, held tens of thousands who cheered battles between gladiators and beasts. Roman law became a foundation for future civilizations. Latin, its language, shaped French, Spanish, Italian, echoes of empire, spoken long after the legions vanished. Their engineering, arches, domes, roads, its standards, modern cities still follow. But it was not all order and marble. Beneath the grandeur, Rome bled. Slavery was rampant. Rebellions erupted. Emperors were gods to some, monsters to others. Caligula, Nero, Domitian. Their names echoed with excess and cruelty. Yet for every mad emperor, there was a builder, a philosopher, a general who pushed the frontier further. The empire was a mosaic of cultures. Romans adopted gods from Greece, Egypt, Persia. They debated Stoicism, worshipped Mithras, and eventually many embraced Christianity, a faith once persecuted but later elevated under Constantine the Great, who saw a vision in the sky and made the cross Rome's new banner. But as centuries passed, the empire grew heavy. Corruption, economic decline, and pressure from migrating tribes gnawed at its edges. The Goths, Huns, and Vandals breached the borders. In 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire fell. Its last emperor deposed, the city sacked, its flame dimmed. Yet Rome never truly died. Its eastern half, Byzantium, would live for another 1,000 years. Its roads still lie beneath European highways. Its ideas of law, citizenship, and governance pulse in modern democracies. And its name, Roman, became a dream empires would chase, from Charlemagne to Mussolini. Rome teaches us that greatness carries weight, that power without balance becomes burden, that roads and walls mean little without unity behind them, and that even in ruins, an empire can whisper to the future. Rome fell, but not all at once. While the Western Empire crumbled under Gothic hooves and internal decay, the eastern half endured. It did not call itself Byzantine, it called itself Roman. Its capital was no longer Rome, but Constantinople, the gleaming city straddling Europe and Asia, founded by Constantine the Great in 330 CE. Here, behind mighty walls and under golden domes, Rome lived on. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, was a world of contrasts, Christian in faith, Roman in law, Greek in language, and Eastern in spirit. It preserved ancient knowledge, nurtured art, and stood as a beacon while Europe descended into what some would later call the Dark Ages. Its heart was Hagia Sophia, a cathedral of staggering beauty. Built under Emperor Justinian, it soared with arches, glittered with mosaics, and echoed with hymns. Justinian himself sought to restore Rome's lost glory, reconquering parts of Italy and North Africa. He also gave the world one of its greatest legal legacies, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a codified Roman law that shaped modern legal systems. Byzantium was a center of trade and diplomacy. Silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, all passed through its gates. But it was also a target for Persians, for Arabs, for Crusaders, and later for the rising power in the East, the Ottoman Turks. Religion became both shield and sword. The empire embraced Eastern Orthodox Christianity, drifting apart from the Roman Catholic West. The schism of 1054 split the church in two, East and West, Greek and Latin, icon and statue. And when Crusaders came, they did not just fight Muslims. They sacked Constantinople in 1204, leaving scars deeper than any enemy blade. Yet Byzantium endured, wounded, weakened, but unbroken. It developed a rich artistic tradition, especially in mosaics and icons. It defended the knowledge of antiquity, copying manuscripts, preserving Plato, Aristotle, and Homer. Its scholars, fleeing the empire's fall, would later spark the European Renaissance with what they carried in their minds and manuscripts. But the end came in 1453. Mehmed II, the young Ottoman Sultan, brought cannons to Constantinople's ancient walls. For 53 days, the city resisted. On the 54th, the walls broke. The last emperor, Constantine XI, fought and died, with sword in hand. As the Ottomans stormed in, the thousand-year echo of Rome faded into the sound of hooves and fire. Yet even in death, Byzantium left fingerprints. The Ottomans adopted much: court rituals, taxes, architecture. The Russians, seeing themselves as heirs to the Orthodox faith, called Moscow the Third Rome. And in the domes of Istanbul, once Constantinople, the past still glows. Rome's ghost never truly vanished. It morphed. It moved in law, in art, in ambition. The dream of empire lived on. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire. It was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The rise of Islamic empires, the age of Ottomans, and the shift of power further east and west. After Rome's twilight and Byzantium's fading glow, a new light emerged from the deserts of Arabia. It began not in palaces or temples, but in a cave with a man who sought silence. In 610 CE, Muhammad, a merchant from Mecca, received a message. That message became a movement. That movement became a world-changing force. Islam. Within a century of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Muslim armies had swept across the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and into Spain. But this was no mere wave of conquest. It was also a wave of knowledge, curiosity, and creativity. The Umayyads first built an empire, establishing Arabic as the language of administration and minting a unified coinage. But it was the Abbasids who seized power in 750 CE that ignited what we now call the Islamic Golden Age. Their capital, Baghdad, became the beating heart of the intellectual world. At the center of his brilliance was the House of Wisdom, a grand library, academy, and translation center. Scholars from all faiths, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, came together to translate Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Aristotle, Galen, Euclid. These works were not merely preserved, they were tested, challenged, and expanded. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra. His name gave us the word algorithm. Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, wrote The Canon of Medicine, which remained a medical standard in Europe for centuries. Ibn al-Haytham pioneered optics and the scientific method. Al-Razi, or Razes, wrote detailed clinical notes on diseases and treatments. Astronomers built observatories. Geographers mapped the known world with accuracy. Philosophers debated existence, reason, and revelation. Poets like Rumi and al-Mutanabi gave voice to soul and struggle, and cities like Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus shimmered with fountains, libraries, and lantern-lit streets. Trade flowed alongside knowledge. From China came paper and silk, from India, spices and numerals, from Africa, gold and salt. Islamic merchants linked worlds, from Timbuktu to Samarkand, from Zanzibar to Java. Yet this age was not immune to shadows. Internal divisions like the Sunni-Shia split shaped politics and belief. Crusades from the west brought bloodshed, and eventually the Mongols thundered in from the east. In 1258, they sacked Baghdad, burning libraries, toppling mosques, and ending the Abbasid Caliphate's reign in fire. But the knowledge endured. Much of what Europe would later claim during the Renaissance had first passed through Arabic hands. The reawakening of Europe was lit by sparks struck in Islamic lands. Medicine, mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, all carried echoes of this golden age. Islamic civilization reminded the world that faith and reason could coexist, that empires could trade not just goods, but ideas, and that in a world torn by conflict, there had once been a house of wisdom where questions were not feared, but welcomed. As the sands of the east lit with knowledge, the west stood in shadow, but not silence. In the ruins of Rome, something new was being born: medieval Europe. Fragmented, feudal, and devout. It was a world where swords carved borders and cathedrals pointed toward salvation. After the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, chaos gripped the continent. Kings ruled small realms. Power lay with those who could defend and with those who claimed to speak for God. The church, centered in Rome, stepped into the vacuum of empire, becoming not just a spiritual force, but a political one. By the 800s, a new empire rose under a warrior king, Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope in 800 CE. He united much of Western Europe. He promoted learning, reformed laws, and supported monasteries. His rule birthed what some call the Carolingian Renaissance, a flicker of order and literacy in a world often ruled by sword and superstition. But after Charlemagne's death, his empire fractured. In his place rose a system that defined the age: feudalism. Land was power. Lords gave land to vassals in return for loyalty and service. At the bottom were serfs bound to the soil, farming the land in exchange for protection. It was not freedom, it was survival. Life in the Middle Ages was hard. Famine, plague, and war were constant threats. Yet amid the hardship, belief was a constant light. The Catholic Church offered salvation, sacraments, and structure. Cathedrals rose across Europe, not just buildings, but symbols of faith, glory, and fear. Their stained glass and soaring spires reminded peasants and kings alike of heaven above and hell below. The church held immense power. It could crown emperors and excommunicate kings. Monasteries preserved ancient texts, copied scriptures, and educated the elite. But power breeds corruption. Greedy bishops, indulgent sellers, and political popes would later provoke cries for reform. By the 11th century, Europe turned its gaze eastward. The Crusades began, a series of religious wars aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim control. Preached as holy missions, they often devolved into chaos, greed, and bloodshed. Cities were sacked, lives were lost, cultures clashed. And while they ultimately failed to hold the Holy Land, the Crusades opened European minds to the wealth and wisdom of the East. Trade routes reopened. Spices, silk, and stories flowed back. And in cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence, a new energy began to stir, one that would soon awaken a slumbering continent. But medieval Europe was not only war and worship. It was also poetry and parchment, castles and codes. It birthed chivalry, courtly love, troubadours, and legends of King Arthur, Joan of Arc, and saints who defied kings. It was a world trying to make sense of chaos through faith. to build heaven amid hardship. And slowly, step by step, it was moving toward something brighter, a rebirth that would redraw the map of thought, the Renaissance. As the echoes of crusades faded and the last plagues claimed their toll, something stirred in the heart of Europe, not with armies or edicts, but with ideas. This was not merely a revival of art, it was a rebirth of humanity itself. The world would later call it the Renaissance, meaning rebirth, and it began not in king's courts, but in the merchant streets of Italy, in cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan. Wealth from trade fed more than gold coffers. It funded painters, sculptors, architects, and thinkers. Families like the Medici became patrons of genius, and across marble studios and ink-stained desks, Europe rediscovered something ancient, the human being. At the center of the Renaissance was humanism, the belief that humans were not just souls waiting for heaven, but capable, curious, and creative in their own right. This shift transformed everything. Artists studied anatomy to better paint God's creation. Architects measured ruins to recreate harmony and proportion. Scholars dug through old scrolls, unearthing the lost wisdom of Greece and Rome. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Last Supper, then dissected corpses by candlelight. His notebooks spilled with inventions, sketches, and dreams. Flying machines, hydraulic lifts, war devices. He was an artist, scientist, and philosopher rolled into one. Michelangelo, with chisel in hand, brought stone to life. His David stood defiant, human, and divine. His ceiling in the Sistine Chapel stretched biblical scenes across a sky of color and faith. Raphael gave grace to faces. Brunelleschi reimagined domes. Donatello molded movement in bronze. Together, they reshaped the world's vision of beauty. But the Renaissance was not only painted in colors, it was also written in fire. Gutenberg's printing press, invented around 1440, changed everything. Books, once hand-copied and rare, could now be mass-produced. Ideas traveled faster than armies. Literacy spread. Bibles, poems, and manifestos rolled off the presses, stirring minds and unsettling powers. And stir they did. The church, once the unchallenged voice of truth, now faced questions. Why must priests mediate faith? Why sell salvation? In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to a church door. He challenged indulgences, hierarchy, and the Pope himself. The Protestant Reformation had begun. Europe fractured into Catholic and Protestant, tradition and reform. Wars followed, but so did debate, democracy, and religious evolution. And meanwhile, beyond Europe's seas, new continents beckoned. The Renaissance spirit of curiosity collided with opportunity, and soon ships would sail toward the unknown, seeking spice, gold, and glory. But before the maps expanded and cannons roared, the Renaissance gave the world something quieter and deeper. It reminded us that to think, to question, to imagine was sacred, that beauty was not only in cathedrals, but in curiosity, and that the human spirit, when unshackled, could reshape the world. As minds soared in Europe's Renaissance, so did sails. Maps once filled with dragons were now redrawn with purpose. Kingdoms hungered for spices, silks, and silver, and they believed the sea held the keys. Thus began the age of exploration, when wooden ships carried iron ambition across waters unknown. In the late 1400s, Portugal led the way. Prince Henry the Navigator funded voyages down Africa's western coast. His explorers mapped, traded, and reached further with each passing year. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip, the Cape of Good Hope. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama reached India, unlocking a sea route long dreamed of. Not to be outdone, Spain gambled west. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail with 3 small ships, believing he could reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic. Instead, he landed in the Caribbean, unknowingly stepping into a new world. He called it India. It was not, but it was rich, vast, and soon contested. The new world was not new to its people. Civilizations like the Aztec, Maya, and Inca had built empires with temples, calendars, and cities. But the arrival of Europeans brought disease, steel, and conquest. Hernan Cortes, with a few hundred men and local allies, brought down the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro shattered the Inca. Guns, germs, and greed tore through centuries of civilization in mere decades. Gold and silver poured into Spanish galleons. Sugar plantations grew, worked by enslaved Africans, shipped across oceans in chains. The Atlantic slave trade became one of the darkest engines of wealth. Millions stolen, sold, and scattered. But it wasn't just blood and bullion. Ideas crossed too. The Columbian Exchange reshaped the planet. Tomatoes, potatoes, maize, and chocolate flowed to Europe. Horses, wheat, and smallpox came to the Americas. Diets changed, ecosystems shifted, empires rose. England, France, and the Dutch soon joined the race. Colonies sprouted along coasts and forests beside rivers. Trade companies like the Dutch East India Company became powers in their own right, with private armies and global reach. Back in Europe, wealth flooded markets, cities swelled, banks grew, but with riches came rivalry. Kingdoms clashed, pirates prowled. The globe, once disconnected, was now entangled by commerce, conquest, and colonization, and yet amid sails and swords, something else stirred: science. Observing stars for navigation led to questions deeper than direction. What moved the heavens? What laws governed motion? What was truth? And who had the right to seek it? The age of exploration had connected the world. Now, minds would begin to explore the universe itself. As ships mapped continents and gold-filled royal vaults, a quieter revolution was taking place, not in courts or colonies, but in observatories and studies where men dared to question the very nature of the universe. This was the scientific revolution, and it would forever change how humanity saw the stars, the earth, and itself. It began with doubt and with Copernicus, a Polish priest who, in the early 1500s, proposed something radical: that the earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. His model contradicted centuries of belief, scripture, and Aristotle himself, but it sparked a fire. A century later, Galileo Galilei pointed a telescope toward the heavens. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, sunspots blemishing perfection, and craters on the moon. The cosmos was not the smooth, divine realm the church had described. It was flawed, in motion, alive. For these views, Galileo was tried, silenced, and forced to recant. But the stars had already spoken. In England, Isaac Newton would bring it all together. His laws of motion and universal gravitation revealed a world bound by predictable forces. The apple that fell from the tree followed the same law that moved the planets. The universe, it seemed, was a giant clock wound by natural law, not divine whim. This was more than astronomy. William Harvey uncovered how blood circulates through the body. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, using handmade microscopes, discovered entire worlds in droplets of water. Francis Bacon championed the scientific method, a way to test, observe, and reason through inquiry. Knowledge once confined to monasteries was now shared through books and letters. The Royal Society in London and the Académie des Sciences in Paris brought thinkers together. Questions were not feared, they were celebrated. And it was not just about the physical world. Thinkers began to examine society, politics, and morality with the same critical lens. Could reason not only unlock the heavens, but improve the human condition? This question gave rise to the Enlightenment, an age where philosophers became revolutionaries with pens instead of swords. They believed in liberty, in reason over superstition, and in the power of education to lift societies. Voltaire mocked kings and priests with wit. Rousseau spoke of freedom and the social contract. Montesquieu argued for separation of powers. And John Locke laid the foundation for democracy. with ideas of natural rights, consent, and the right to rebel. Together, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment lit a fuse beneath the old world. Kings who ruled by divine right, churches that forbade questions, these would not go unchallenged for long. The universe had changed. Now, the world would follow. As ships mapped continents in gold-filled royal vaults, a quieter revolution was taking place, not in courts or colonies, but in observatories and studies where men dared question the very nature of the universe. This was the scientific revolution, and it would forever change how humanity saw the stars, the earth, and itself. It began with doubt, and with Copernicus, a Polish priest who, in the early 1500s, proposed something radical, that the earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. His model contradicted centuries of belief, scripture, and Aristotle himself, but it sparked a fire. A century later, Galilei pointed a telescope toward the heavens. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, sunspots blemishing perfection, and craters on the moon. The cosmos was not the smooth, divine realm the church had described. It was flawed, in motion, alive. For these views, Galileo was tried, silenced, and forced to recant. But the stars had already spoken. In England, Isaac Newton would bring it all together. His laws of motion and universal gravitation revealed a world bound by predictable forces. The apple that fell from the tree followed the same law that moved the planets. The universe, it seemed, was a giant clock wound by natural law, not divine whim. This was more than astronomy. William Harvey uncovered how blood circulates through the body, and Tony van Leeuwenhoek, using handmade microscopes, discovered entire worlds in droplets of water. Francis Bacon championed the scientific method, a way to test, observe, and reason through inquiry. Knowledge once confined to monasteries was now shared through books and letters. The Royal Society in London and the Académie des Sciences in Paris brought thinkers together. Questions were not feared, they were celebrated. And it was not just about the physical world. Thinkers began to examine society, politics, and morality with the same critical lens. Could reason not only unlock the heavens, but improve the human condition? This question gave rise to the Enlightenment, an age where philosophers became revolutionaries with pens instead of swords. They believed in liberty, in reason over superstition, and in the power of education to lift societies. Voltaire mocked kings and priests with wit. Rousseau spoke of freedom and the social contract. Montesquieu argued for separation of powers, and John Locke laid the foundation for democracy, with ideas of natural rights, consent, and the right to rebel. Together, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment lit a fuse beneath the old world. Kings who ruled by divine right, churches that forbade questions. These would not go unchallenged for long. The universe had changed. Now the world would follow. The French people, fueled by Rousseau's cry for equality and Voltaire's rage against tyranny, overthrew the monarchy. They declared liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. Kings were dethroned. Churches were stripped. A new calendar was made. The world turned upside down. But revolutions are rarely gentle. France descended into chaos. The reign of terror led by Robespierre saw thousands guillotined, nobles, priests, even fellow revolutionaries. Blood ran as red as their banners. Out of this turmoil rose a new figure. Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant general, he seized power, crowned himself emperor, and led France to conquer much of Europe. Yet even as he chased empire, he carried the revolution's code, spreading legal reform, meritocracy, and nationalism wherever his armies marched. But empires fall. In 1815 at Waterloo, Napoleon met defeat. Monarchies returned. Yet the world had changed. The revolutions didn't end with France. In Haiti, enslaved people, led by Toussaint Louverture, fought off French armies and declared the first Black Republic. Across Latin America, Leaders like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin cast off Spanish rule, inspired by liberty and national pride. The age of revolutions cracked open the old world. Kings would never again rule unchallenged. People had tasted power, and though revolutions brought blood, they also birthed nations, constitutions, and the enduring idea that people have the right to shape their own destiny. And so, the 19th century dawned, not with silence, but with a thunder of change still echoing across oceans and empires. As the echoes of revolution faded, a different roar rose, not from crowds, but from machines. The 19th century would not be shaped by kings or philosophers alone, but by inventors, engineers, and factory hands. This was the Industrial Revolution, and it would transform the way humans lived, worked, moved, and dreamed. It began in Britain, where coal was plentiful, rivers powered mills, and colonial trade had made capital abundant. In workshops and textile mills, human hands were replaced by mechanical looms, spinning jennies, and steam engines. Cloth, once spun by cottage weavers, now flowed endlessly from factory floors. At the heart of this transformation was the steam engine, perfected by James Watt. It powered not only factories, but trains and ships, shrinking distance and redefining time. A journey that once took weeks could now be done in days. Cities were connected, markets expanded, horizons widened, but progress had a price. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and London swelled with workers, men, women, and even children, drawn by wages, but often trapped in cramped, filthy tenements. The air choked with soot, streets overflowed with waste, disease spread. The factory bell replaced the village sun. In mines and mills, work was long, dangerous, and repetitive. Children crawled through coal seams, women worked machines for pennies, yet amidst the smog, innovation bloomed. Henry Bessemer revolutionized steel production. George Stephenson's locomotives changed travel. Eli Whitney's cotton gin reshaped agriculture and slavery. Thomas Edison lit homes with electric bulbs, while Alexander Graham Bell connected voices through wires, and in this age of progress, science advanced too. Charles Darwin proposed evolution by natural selection, shaking the foundations of faith and biology alike. Louis Pasteur discovered germs, changing how we fight disease. Florence Nightingale redefined nursing. Public health became a cause, not a luxury, but the revolution was not confined to Britain. It spread to Germany, France, the United States, and beyond. New industries rose: chemicals, railroads, telegraphs, and banking. Capitalism flourished, but so did inequality. In response, voices rose. Karl Marx, witnessing worker misery, predicted that the proletariat would rise against the bourgeoisie. His Communist Manifesto became a rallying cry across nations. Even as industrialists amassed fortunes, empires expanded too. With machines came might. Europe, armed with steel and ships, turned toward Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, carving up the globe in the name of trade and civilization. This was the age of colonialism, where factories at home were fed by resources abroad, and profit marched hand in hand with conquest. Yet even in hardship, hope stirred. Labor unions formed, laws changed, public schools opened, women demanded rights, workers demanded dignity. The world, once powered by muscle, now turned on gears, but the human spirit refused to be automated. The Industrial Revolution brought wealth and wonder, but also soot and sorrow. It birthed a new kind of world, loud, crowded, fast, a world hurtling toward modernity with no breaks in sight. By the late 19th century, steamships plowed across oceans, telegraph wires spanned continents, and smokestacks crowned city skylines. The world had grown smaller, but more divided. This was the age of empire, when European powers painted vast swaths of the globe with their flags, driven by ambition, industry, and the belief that they had the right to rule others. Britain stood tallest, boasting an empire on which the sun never set. From India to Egypt, from South Africa to Hong Kong, British influence shaped railways, schools, and courts
often at the expense of local customs, freedoms, and dignity. In India, the jewel of the British crown, the British East India Company, gave way to direct imperial rule after the 1857 rebellion, a bloody uprising rooted in disrespect, injustice, and broken promises. France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and others joined the race, carving Africa like a pie at the 1884 Berlin Conference, without a single African voice at the table. The Congo, claimed by Belgium's King Leopold II, became a site of horror, where millions died harvesting rubber for European markets. To the colonizers, it was a mission, bringing civilization, Christianity, and commerce. But to the colonized, it often meant land stolen, languages suppressed, cultures dismantled, and labor exploited. Indigenous resistance flared across the globe in Algeria, Zululands, Burma, China, and beyond. But the gunpowder and steel of empire were hard to overcome. Meanwhile, the United States expanded westward, displacing Native Americans through treaties, wars, and forced marches, like the Trail of Tears. Later, it too reached outward, into the Philippines, Cuba, and Hawaii, joining the Imperial Club under banners of liberty and progress. Japan, watching the West carve Asia, chose a different path. During the Meiji Restoration, it modernized rapidly, building factories, railroads, and a military. By the early 20th century, Japan became an empire itself, defeating China and even Russia, proving that an Asian power could stand toe-to-toe with the West. But as empires grew, so did rivalries. Trade routes overlapped, borders clashed, arms races began. In Europe, alliances hardened, drawing lines in the sand. The world teetered on edge, even as it celebrated modern marvels. Cities dazzled with electric lights and world fairs. The Eiffel Tower rose, the Titanic sailed, planes touched the sky, but beneath the surface old tensions simmered. The nations of Europe were armed, proud, and intertwined, a fragile web waiting for a spark. And in 1914, in a corner of the Balkans, that spark came. The world entered the 20th century with steam, science, and swagger. But behind the glowing cities and soaring towers, Europe was a tinderbox. Alliances bound nations together in knots, and every empire was armed to the teeth. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, it lit the fuse that would explode into the first truly global war. One by one, dominoes fell. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia backed Serbia. Germany backed Austria. France supported Russia. Germany invaded Belgium to strike France. Britain declared war. In weeks, the world was engulfed. This wasn't just a regional conflict. This was World War I. It was a new kind of war, not of horses and sabers, but of trenches, tanks, machine guns, and poison gas. The Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, became a graveyard of mud and barbed wire. Millions of men sat in waterlogged trenches, dodging shells, charging into machine gun fire, and praying to survive another hour. Battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres claimed hundreds of thousands of lives for mere yards of land. The scale of suffering was unimaginable. Letters home spoke of rats, lice, fear, and the unending thunder of artillery. The war, meant to end quickly, dragged on for 4 long years. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front saw brutal battles between Russia and Germany. In the south, the Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany, fought the British and Arabs. In the colonies, millions of Africans, Indians, and Asians were drawn into a war not of their making, as soldiers, laborers, and supply bearers. And in 1917, 2 events shifted everything. First, Russia collapsed. Exhausted, starving, and disillusioned, its people overthrew the Tsar. Vladimir Lenin, backed by revolutionaries and with German support, seized power and pulled Russia from the war. A new communist state was born, the Soviet Union.
Second, America entered the war. Outraged by German submarine attacks and emboldened by President Woodrow Wilson's idealism, the U.S. joined the Allies. With fresh troops and supplies, the tide turned. By 1918, the Central Powers crumbled. Germany, starving and in revolt, signed an armistice. On November 11th, the guns fell silent, but peace came with pain. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, punished Germany harshly, demanding territorial losses, military restrictions, and crippling reparations. Germany was humiliated. Resentment festered. Millions were dead. Empires were gone. The Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German. Borders were redrawn. New nations emerged, but the world, still reeling, struggled to recover. The League of Nations was formed to preserve peace, but it lacked power. The 1920s brought brief hope. Jazz, art, airplanes, but underneath wounds remained. Economies trembled. Extremism grew. The Great War was supposed to end all wars. Instead, it became a prelude, a shadow under which the world would once again descend into darkness. The First World War had ended, but peace proved fragile. The world had changed, politically, socially, and economically. Soldiers returned to broken homes. Empires had vanished, and in the 1930s, the very foundations of civilization would be shaken again, not by bullets, but by banks, fear, and flags. In 1929, the New York stock market crashed, wiping out fortunes in hours. Businesses collapsed, banks failed, millions lost jobs. This was the start of the Great Depression, and its effects rippled far beyond America. In Germany, already burdened by war reparations and inflation, the crisis was catastrophic. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Children starved. Desperation deepened, and in desperation, people often seek saviors. In Italy, a former soldier named Benito Mussolini promised to restore Roman glory. He seized power in 1922, declaring himself Il Duce. In Germany, a bitter veteran and failed artist, Adolf Hitler, blamed Jews, communists, and the Treaty of Versailles for his country's suffering. He rose swiftly using fiery speeches, propaganda, and fear. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. Soon he banned opposition parties, silenced critics, and declared the Third Reich. The swastika flew over Germany, and its streets echoed with marching boots and burning books. Under Hitler's rule, Germany rearmed. Roads and factories were built, the economy revived, but the cost was freedom. Jews were stripped of rights, camps were built, neighbors disappeared, and the world watched, uncertain, unwilling, or unable to stop it. Meanwhile, in Japan, militarists seized control, dreaming of an empire across Asia. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria. In 1937, they launched full war against China, committing atrocities like the rape of Nanking, where hundreds of thousands were murdered. The world tried to stay neutral. The League of Nations condemned, but did nothing. Western powers, still scarred by World War I, hoped appeasement might work. But fascism does not retreat. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, violating the Versailles Treaty. In 1938, he annexed Austria. Then came Czechoslovakia. Leaders met in Munich and gave in, hoping peace could be preserved. It wasn't. In 1939, Hitler signed a secret pact with Stalin's Soviet Union. Days later, German troops invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. The world stood once more on the edge of fire, not only of nations clashing, but of humanity being tested in ways darker than ever before. By 1939, the world had failed to prevent another catastrophe. World War II erupted with fury unmatched in human history. It was not just a war between nations, it was a struggle for the soul of the world. Germany's Blitzkrieg, lightning war, tore through Poland, then Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. In months, Hitler had conquered most of Europe. Only Britain stood firm, enduring relentless bombing in the Battle of Britain, as Winston Churchill rallied the nation with defiant words. In the East, Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Brutal winters and fierce Soviet resistance slowed the Nazi advance, leading to the epic Battle of Stalingrad, where the tide began to turn. Meanwhile, across the globe, another front exploded. On December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the war. America's industrial might and manpower changed the game. Battles raged in the Pacific, from Midway to Guadalcanal, as U.S. forces pushed back against Japan's island empire. But amid the battles, darker horrors unfolded. In Nazi-occupied Europe, the Holocaust took shape. 6 million Jews, along with Romani people, political dissidents, and others, were systematically murdered in ghettos, mass shootings, and death camps like Auschwitz. The world would later stand in silence before the gas chambers and crematoria, asking how such evil was allowed to grow. The Allies pressed forward. In 1944, they landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, opening a Western front. Germany was squeezed from both sides. In April 1945, Hitler took his own life. Days later, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe was declared, but the war wasn't over. In the Pacific, Japan fought fiercely. To end the war quickly and avoid massive casualties, the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities were vaporized. Tens of thousands died instantly. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war was over, but the world had been reshaped. Over 70 million lives were lost. Cities lay in ruins. The map was redrawn. The United Nations was formed, hoping to preserve peace where the League had failed, but new tensions rose. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies, became rivals in a Cold War, a standoff of spies, nukes, and ideology. The world now lived under the shadow of atomic fire. Yet out of the ashes came hope. Colonies fought for independence. Civil rights movements rose. Technology leapt forward. Rockets, computers, medicine. Mankind even reached the moon. The past 1,000 years had seen empires rise, ideas burn, machines awaken, and humanity evolve. Blood had been spilled, but so had ink. Chains had been forged, but also broken. History is not just a record of war and rulers. It is a story of us, lots of people striving, failing, rising again. And though the future remains unwritten, the echoes of the past remind us we have survived, we have changed, and we can choose what comes next.